Question 4 is a critical thinking question. We are presented with a paragraph of information and asked to evaluate it in a certain way. We should jump to the end of this point and see which type of question we're being asked. Here we can see that we're being asked which of the following identifies a flaw in the above argument. So this type of question is where we're presented with 4 options of potential flaws with the argument presented in the paragraph. It's these that we'll assess. At this point we can read the question as follows. When we listen to music, electrical waves in our brains tend to synchronize to the tempo. Okay, we can take a break there and we can see that that's a statement of fact. In a recent study, scientists recorded the brainwaves of musicians and non-musicians as they listened to music. Although the brainwaves of both groups synchronized to many rhythms, those of non-musicians did not synchronize to slow music. The non-musicians reported that they could not keep track when it came to listening to the tempo of slow music. This shows that becoming a musician requires an innate tendency for the brain to synchronize to the tempo of any speed of music. So let's highlight the key elements of that conclusion, that musicians require an innate tendency and they have to be able to sync to any speed of music. Now at this point you may be unconvinced that this is a conclusion that can be drawn from the preceding text, and it might be a good idea for you to draft your own potential flaws in the above argument before we go on to assess the options. I'll give you a moment to pause and write a few concise sentences now. Let's turn to each of the individual options and see if it is a flaw in the argument, which I've summarised above. A is that the tempo of the slow music may be the most difficult tempo for the listeners to follow. Now this doesn't challenge the conclusion that there is an innate tendency among musicians to sync to any speed of music. In fact, this statement could be seen as a ratification of the findings of the study, that all listeners find it hard to listen to slow music, and that non-musicians find it especially difficult, and this could be because of an innate thing. So we won't go with that one. Now option B posits that musical training may develop the tendency for the brain to synchronise to music. This directly challenges the idea that musicians require an innate tendency, and, as far as we're concerned, could be an alternative explanation for the difference between the musicians and the non-musicians with respect to slow music. So that is, to all extents and purposes, an argument against the conclusion drawn. And it clearly identifies a flaw in reaching that specific conclusion. Now point C says that some of the non-musicians may decide to undertake musical training in the future. Now, if, for example, this statement had said some non-musicians went on to undertake musical training and match the performance of the musicians, then that would identify a flaw with the argument. But as it stands, it doesn't go on to say that these non-musicians who undertake future musical training will be as good at identifying slow music. Finally, D says that becoming a musician may depend on a number of different abilities. Now this doesn't directly challenge the conclusion in the argument that musicians require an innate tendency, because this may fall into the number of different abilities required to become a musician. In fact, it may be adding to the distinction between musicians and non-musicians, which may well not be there. Bearing all of that in mind, it's best to return to B, which most clearly offered an alternate explanation for the findings of the results, namely that it's training as opposed to an innate tendency that develops the tendency for the brain to synchronise to music, which was seen to be better in musicians as opposed to non-musicians. So, for that reason, the answer is B.